There are moments in life that shift the way we see everything, not in loud, dramatic scenes, but in quiet, almost imperceptible exchanges that awaken something eternal inside us. I never expected that one of the most defining experiences of my life would emerge not from power, theology, or doctrine, but from a silent bond, forged in a garden, with a creature many would have overlooked. This is not a story of status or prestige. It is a story of presence. And if you'll stay with me, I'll show you how a single act of love, unplanned, unstructured, and deeply human, revealed the face of God. As the sun began to fall behind the colonnades of St. Peter's, I knew we were approaching something final. Not just the end of a season, not just the conclusion of a papacy, but the closing breaths of a man who had shaped the hearts of millions, including mine. The Vatican, usually a hive of coordinated purpose and protocol, seemed to pause. You could feel it in the air, like a held breath stretching through the corridors. Every whisper echoed longer. Every footstep softened. The silence was not empty. It was sacred. I remember stepping through the stone hallways with a weight in my chest I couldn't explain. We had all seen the changes. His steps had slowed. His voice had become more fragile. But the strength in his gaze, though dimmed, still carried the warmth of someone who had never forgotten what mattered. He didn't ask for titles. He didn't surround himself with ceremonial dignity. In those final days, what he wanted wasn't a legacy carved into marble. It was something far more human, more honest. And as I stood beside his modest room, I realized something many had missed. He was preparing not for death, but for a final expression of love. You may not believe this, but the man who had stood before crowds of thousands, who had carried the burden of leadership with humility and grace, made his final request not for a counsel, nor for a confession. He asked for a dog, a mutt, no pedigree, no royal lineage, just Esteban. When Sister Cecilia first told us what he'd said, "Bring him," we were stunned. At first, we thought he meant a cardinal or an old friend, but he was clear. Esteban, he had whispered. And something in that name held more conviction than any papal decree. I remember walking into the garden, uncertain, even afraid. Afraid of judgment. Afraid that we were breaking some sacred code. But the moment I saw Esteban lying beneath the olive tree, eyes alert, as if waiting for this very moment, all that fear melted into something else. Reverence. Without needing to be called, he stood. His legs were stiff. His fur was matted. But he carried himself like one who had been summoned by heaven. As we opened the doors of the palace, I knew we were participating in a miracle. One not made of thunder and lightning, but of fur, silence, and unwavering loyalty. The Swiss guards didn't move. No one tried to stop him. It was as if every stone, every fresco, every portrait of saints knew that what was happening transcended protocol. Esteban walked those halls like he belonged, because in truth, he did. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he had given, his presence. And as he stepped into the Pope's room, the transformation was complete. The great man who had comforted the world now found his own comfort in the gentle breath of a forgotten dog. I stood by the doorway and watched it unfold. The Holy Father smiled, really smiled. Not the polite kind you give to cameras or diplomats, but the kind reserved for those who have seen you at your worst and stayed. Esteban didn't bark, didn't leap. He simply laid his head by the bed, and Francis, fragile, trembling, reached out to touch him. That touch, that single act, it spoke more than any homily, more than any doctrine. It was a benediction of presence, a declaration that even at the end, what matters most is not the might of our position, but the sincerity of our love. That moment changed me, forever, because it wasn't about religion or rules. It wasn't about theology. It was about the raw, sacred truth that we are made for connection. That love, the kind that stays, the kind that kneels, the kind that does not flinch in the face of death, is the closest thing to God we'll ever know on this side of heaven. And so I ask you now, before we go any further, who is your Esteban? Who have you overlooked? Because the way we love the least of these reveals everything about the way we understand grace. It's strange how the world teaches us to look upward, to chase importance, to admire those who shine. But what Pope Francis taught me through Esteban was the opposite. He looked down, quite literally, into the eyes of a limping, scarred creature, and saw worth. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was recognition. He saw something holy in that animal's brokenness, and in doing so, he gave me permission to look again at my own wounds, at the parts of me I try to hide. Maybe you've done that too, believed that only your polished, strong, competent self deserves love. But here was a man who chose, in his last moments, to be seen with a dog who had never won a prize, and never would. And it was beautiful. You see, love that only honors strength isn't really love. It's performance. Real love, gospel love, moves toward weakness. It doesn't flinch from imperfection. Esteban was living proof of that. He didn't speak. He didn't preach. He didn't write. But he stayed. And I've come to believe that staying is the greatest sermon you can ever preach. In a world obsessed with leaving, with chasing better, with self-optimizing everything, we forget the power of presence. The kind that doesn't fix you, but doesn't leave you. Esteban didn't try to heal the Pope. He simply laid down beside him. And somehow, that was enough. There's something sacred in silence, something that speaks when words run out. When I watched the Pope and Esteban sit in silence, I was forced to confront my addiction to noise. I fill my life with distractions, apps, schedules, voices. But in that room, with one dying man and one aging dog, there was nothing but breath, stillness, and grace. And it was enough. I wonder, what would happen if we made more space for silence in our lives? What would we hear if we stopped trying to prove something all the time? Because I heard something in that room. Not a sound exactly, but a presence, a peace that passes understanding. The first time Pope Francis saw Esteban, I later learned, he didn't try to pet him. He didn't call him. He knelt, slowly, painfully, with the deliberate humility of someone who knows his power and chooses to lay it down. That gesture, more than any speech, was the beginning of their bond. You don't force a broken soul to come near. You invite. You wait. You show that you're not a threat. And in that simple act, he was preaching the gospel in a way few ever do. I think about that every time I want someone to change or come closer. The temptation is to control, but real love waits. Real love kneels. It's easy to admire this story from a distance, to feel warmth and maybe a tear. But the question I can't escape, the one that has chased me since that moment, is this. Am I willing to do the same? Am I willing to kneel? To slow down enough to notice the overlooked? To see the Esteban in others, and maybe even in myself? We live in a culture that praises usefulness, productivity, and polish. But Pope Francis, in his final days, reminded us that heaven doesn't measure success the way earth does. What if the real currency of eternity is faithfulness, not fame? Presence, not prestige? And so I ask you, not out of obligation, but out of longing, what would it look like for you to kneel today? Who in your life is waiting to be noticed? Who doesn't speak, doesn't ask, but stays quietly in the background? The answer won't come with trumpets. It won't come with glory. It will come in stillness, in the gentle rustling of a soul opening up. That's what Esteban taught me. And through him, Pope Francis taught me again what I had forgotten, that the kingdom of God doesn't come through spectacle. It comes through staying. I remember the first time I heard someone call Esteban a nuisance. It was early on, when most didn't understand the Pope's attachment to him. There were whispers, comments about appearances, about what was proper. A mutt in the Vatican? It felt unbecoming to some, but Francis paid them no mind. In fact, he welcomed the tension. Because love that never offends the proud probably isn't real love. Real love disturbs. It disrupts the system. That's why it's so rare. And that's why Francis's love for Esteban mattered. It wasn't decorative, it was defiant. It's easy to love what's approved, endorsed, blessed by consensus. But what about the things no one claps for? What about the people who don't fit? Esteban didn't ask to be seen. He didn't try to earn a place. He simply existed. And Pope Francis, in one of the most sacred acts of his life, decided that was enough. I carry that with me now. I see it when I pass the homeless man on my street. When I see the awkward, unnoticed kid at church, I hear that whisper in my heart. He is enough. Not because of what he offers, but because of who he is. That's the gospel. Nothing more, nothing less. Esteban wasn't a symbol to the Pope. He was a friend. That distinction matters. because we're tempted to turn people into metaphors. But Francis didn't use Esteban to prove a point. He cherished him for who he was. That's the mark of true love. You don't turn someone into a project. You don't mold them into a parable. You sit with them. You see them. You let them be. That takes humility, and it takes time. Francis had both, and so he gave both. To a dusty dog no one else noticed. That's the kind of legacy that heaven celebrates. I still remember watching Esteban one morning, how he waited by the door, never barking, never pacing, just waiting. And when Francis emerged, he didn't jump, he didn't beg, he just walked beside him. That's presence, that's loyalty. And in that moment, I saw the gospel walking on 4 legs. I saw Christ in the fur of a stray, not in power, not in perfection, but in proximity. And I wept, because I realized how often I've measured love by grand gestures, when perhaps the truest love is simply not leaving. The Pope called it a living sermon. He meant that Esteban didn't just represent a truth, he embodied it. Every time he walked beside Francis, every time he sat in silence, he was teaching us something. He was reminding us of the love that stays, the love that doesn't count cost, the love that doesn't need applause. If the church could learn to love like that, not just in mission statements or slogans, but in the quiet hours of real life, the world would change. Not overnight, not dramatically, but deeply, eternally. This story isn't famous, it won't go viral, but it has marked me more than any conference, sermon, or theology class, because it reached me in the place where I hide my fears, where I wonder if I'm too broken to be held, where I wonder if I'll be loved when I have nothing left to give. Esteban answered that. So did Pope Francis. And if you let this truth sink into your soul, it will answer that question for you too. You are enough. You are seen. You are loved, not for your strength, but in your stillness. There were days when I would pass by the gardens and see them there. Francis on the bench, Esteban at his feet. No conversation, no agenda, just 2 beings, present to one another. And every time, it undid me, because I realized how addicted I had become to doing, achieving, solving. But there they were, proving that the deepest things in life don't require motion, just presence. And I began to wonder, how often do we miss the sacred because we're rushing toward the sensational? How often do we bypass the holy because it isn't loud enough to get our attention? That garden became their cathedral. No stained glass, no organ, no incense, just olive trees, the hum of the earth, and a love too deep for words. And the more time I spent watching them, the more I saw myself, not in the Pope, but in Esteban. Hesitant, wounded, not sure if I belonged, but longing to be near something good, something steady. And I saw that the invitation of Christ is not to clean yourself up and be perfect. It's to come as you are with your limp, your dust, your history, and stay. Not to prove anything, just to stay. That's what Esteban did. He stayed. Through heat and rain, through days when the Pope was strong and days when he wasn't. He stayed when others left. He stayed when no one noticed. And in that simple faithfulness, he showed us what love looks like with skin, or fur, on it. No performance, no conditions, just presence. The more I think about it, the more I believe this is what the church is meant to be. A place where people, however broken, can find safety, not because they deserve it, but because they're seen. There was a moment, near the end, when Francis could barely lift his head. The doctors moved quietly, the sisters prayed, but Esteban didn't flinch. He lay beside the bed, his head against the wood, not moving for hours. And in that stillness, I saw the face of Christ. Because isn't that what the incarnation is? God with us. Not from a distance, but up close in the dust, in the ache, in the silence. That's what Esteban gave him. Not theology, not theory, but the ministry of being near. And it undid me. I've spent years in ministry. I've studied, preached, counseled, led. But nothing taught me more about God than that scene. A man preparing to die. A stray dog resting beside him. No applause, no spectacle, just love. And I realized I've had it backward. I thought ministry was about influence, about articulation, about momentum. But true ministry begins with presence, with showing up, with staying when it's inconvenient, with not looking away. And if we miss that, we've missed the whole point. I don't share this story because it's sweet or sentimental. I share it because it's sacred, because it changed me, because I believe it can change you. We all have someone in our life who's waiting for us to notice. Someone we've walked past. Someone who doesn't ask for much, only that we be there, that we sit down, that we kneel. And maybe, like Esteban, they don't even know how to ask, but they're waiting, not for answers, for presence, for someone who will stay. So I'll ask you again, what would it look like to show up today? Not with the perfect words, not with grand plans, just with your attention, your availability, your love. That's what Esteban gave the Pope, and that's what Francis gave to him. And in doing so, they preached a gospel too deep for language. One that echoes through gardens and grief and quiet afternoons. One that invites us to stop rushing, stop climbing, and simply be. Because in the end, the most powerful thing you can offer anyone is yourself. After Francis passed, I returned to the gardens. Not out of duty, but longing. The trees seemed quieter, the air heavier. But Esteban was there, older now, slower, but still waiting, still watching. And as I stood there, I realized that some presences never really leave. The Pope had gone, but his spirit lingered, in the soil, in the silence, in the soul of a dog who had loved him with holy devotion. And I wept, not because of loss, but because of beauty, because love that deep doesn't die. It echoes. There were some who thought the dog would leave, that once his master was gone, he'd wander off again. But he didn't. He stayed. He walked the same paths. He lay beneath the same trees. And in some strange way, he became the keeper of the story, a four-legged witness to grace. People started to notice. Pilgrims would pause. They'd ask about him. And those who heard his story were moved, not by theology or doctrine, but by devotion. And I knew then, the legacy had not ended. It had just begun. I started talking to him, not out loud at first, just in my thoughts. I'd sit beside him on the bench where he and the Pope had sat, and I'd feel something settle in me, a quietness, a grounding, a reminder that I didn't need to perform to be loved, that my presence, though flawed, though incomplete, was enough. Esteban never responded, but somehow, I knew he understood, because love like that doesn't need words. It just needs time. One day I brought a friend to the gardens. She had been struggling, burned out by ministry, disillusioned by church. I didn't say much. I just walked her to the bench and told her the story. She cried, not because of grief, but because of recognition. She saw herself in Esteban, in his scars, in his silence, and for the first time in months, she breathed deeply, and she whispered something I'll never forget. I think I just remembered who I am. That's the power of presence. It reawakens us. The Vatican is filled with treasures, art, history, tradition. But I will always believe that one of its greatest treasures walked on four legs and wore no crown. Esteban didn't build anything. He didn't lead. He didn't teach. But he loved. And in that, he changed everything. That's what I carry with me now. That love, when it is simple and steadfast, is holy. And I want to live like that. I want to stay. I want to kneel. I want to love in a way that doesn't seek to be seen, but cannot help but be remembered. If you're still listening, I want to thank you, not just for your attention, but for your openness. Because I know this kind of story doesn't make headlines. It doesn't trend, but it matters. And I believe it's calling you now to love slower, to see deeper, to stay longer, and maybe, just maybe, to find your own garden, your own Esteban, your own moment when heaven touches earth, not in glory, but in grace. So go, but don't go fast. Look around, listen closely, and when you find the one who waits, whether it's a person, a creature, or even a part of yourself, don't rush past. Sit down, be still, and stay. Because love doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just stays. What began as a quiet moment between a man and a stray dog ended up becoming one of the loudest sermons I've ever heard. It wasn't proclaimed from a pulpit. It wasn't wrapped in titles or rituals. It was lived, through presence, through patience, through love that didn't need to be earned. And if this story has touched you, if something inside you stirred as you listened, then maybe it's because you too are longing for a love that stays, a love that sees you, a love that chooses you in your most vulnerable state and refuses to leave. This isn't just about a dog. It's not even just about Pope Francis. It's about the gospel. It's about the heart of Jesus, who didn't love us from afar but stepped into our dust, our hunger, our fear, and stayed. He stayed when others left. He stayed when we doubted him. He stayed through the cross. And today, he's still staying. With you, right now. And so I ask you, not as a demand, but as an invitation. Will you stay with him too? If this message spoke to you, don't let it end here. Inscribe it into your life. Start by subscribing to this channel, not for my sake, but because every message here is a step deeper into the heart of Christ. And if you've been feeling far from God, today is your chance to come close again. Not by fixing everything, not by being perfect, but by staying. By simply showing up with your heart open and your soul willing to be seen. So I'm asking you, subscribe to the channel. Stay connected. Let these stories remind you of who you are and whose you are. Share this message with someone who feels forgotten, overlooked, unseen. Because we were never meant to walk alone. And if you've never made the decision to follow Jesus, let today be the beginning. Not with fireworks, but with stillness, with surrender, with presence. Whisper it right now. Jesus, I want to stay. He's already here. He always was. And if you've already chosen to walk with him, then let this be a reminder of how he's called you to walk with others. Not ahead of them, not above them, but beside them. In gardens, in grief, in ordinary sacred spaces where love still blooms slowly. Stay faithful, stay present, stay loving. That's the real calling. That's the legacy we've inherited. Not of dominance, but of devotion. Thank you for being here, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. I feel the weight of your presence, and it matters. You matter. This isn't just a video. It's a sacred space we've created together. One rooted in truth, soaked in grace, and stitched with the kind of love that endures. My hope is that you leave not just inspired, but changed. Not just moved, but motivated to see differently, love deeply, and remain faithfully. Until next time, stay with him. Stay with those who need you. Stay rooted in the kind of love that doesn't let go. And remember, you are seen. You are loved. You are not alone. I'll be here waiting whenever you're ready to return, and I hope you do.